The escalating scope of sanctions targeting Russia continues ever upwards. We are, at the time of recording, 18,472 sanctions up on where we were before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And given that Moscow already had 2,695 sanctions hanging over its head before that, you'll get some idea of how rapid that escalation has really been. Now, the fact that these sanctions have added expensive complexity and risk on a shipping market that was, at least initially, ill-prepared to deal with the scale of the incoming compliance requirements, well, that's pretty well understood. The fact that these sanctions have created a parallel dark fleet of ships operating outside of the scope of Western sanctions is known. But the detail of what all this means for shipping in practice, the fact that insurers have been left trying to enforce an increasingly unenforceable regime, the fact that sanctions have inadvertently undermined shipping safety standards and the rules-based order upon which it relies, well, that's too often overlooked and, I would say, misunderstood. So this week, I want to delve a little bit deeper into the unintended consequences of sanctions and focus specifically on the insurers that have been caught in the crosshairs of a compliance crackdown, the likes of which has never been seen before.
We have no way of knowing for sure whether this documentation that we're receiving is valid or not.
Right now, we have seen something like 50 incidents to date, some of them catastrophic in the sense that there have been explosions, there have been loss of life, and if they are involved in a large-scale incident, the cost of those we already know from previous experiences can be hundreds of millions.
If a ship doesn't have adequate insurance, and these are big tankers carrying lots of Russian oil, if there is an accident, then there are going to be some very significant consequences.
Okay, let's start with a quick recap, because before we can really understand why sanctions have inadvertently undermined shipping safety, why we have a dark fleet at all, and how we've ended up with an oil price cap that is widely regarded by the insurance sector as unenforceable, well, we need to understand what has changed and specifically why sanctions have created such a headache for shipping's insurers, the P&I Clubs.
So the sanctions regime over the last, let's call it 3 years, has changed dramatically. And what do I mean by that? Prior to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, there were sanctions. There always have been sanctions, but most of them are very specific to the United States and to OFAC, having to do with Cuba, Syria, Venezuela, Iran. Now Europe, the United Kingdom, even at some point the United Nations have all come in with their version of sanctions. So for us, we now have had to adapt to knowing and fully understanding, to the extent that we can, the sanctions from all the different regimes to ensure that our members who are located all over the world, including Europe, including the United Kingdom, including the US and other places, are following those sanctions. And so it has placed on us a tremendous amount of pressure to update platforms, to get satellite services, to get AIS, which is monitoring services for vessels, transponder, and to hire people and or train people who can deal with these types of events. In other words, who fully can understand the sanctions regimes and how they apply, and a review of what the findings are through the platforms and how do they apply to those sanctions. So it has been a brain drain, increased need for personnel, for technological advancements, and increase in the time devoted to it.
That's Dan Tadros. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the American Club. And what he's describing there in terms of the investments required to deal with this increased complexity is being replicated across the P&I Clubs. It's been a very steep and expensive learning curve for them.
As an example, our expenses related to compliance have grown exponentially, probably to the tune of fivefold of what it was, both in terms of platforms and various programs that we use, including the satellite services and the AIS monitoring, plus the personnel. Having to increase personnel, we've increased 3 times the number of personnel. So it's been a significant expenditure, an investment. I would call it's an investment really, to ensure that all these sanctions regulations are followed.
Sanctions, of course, aren't new, but it's only in the relatively recent past that regulators have started to put more and more pressure on Western insurers, effectively as de facto enforcers of foreign policy. That's always been a problem for the P&I Clubs.
A role that we have never been comfortable with and have said repeatedly we're not comfortable with, because it's not our job. We're not the police officer of the seas. We're not there to police these sanctions. We're not there to enforce the sanctions. That's the role of states. But nevertheless, that's been forced upon us.
That's Tony Paulson, Head of Asia and Corporate, West of England P&I. But he's also become one of the leading experts in sanctions compliance for shipping as a result of the rapid influx of requirements hitting clubs like his over the past few years. Like Dan, he's had to invest heavily and rapidly to create global compliance teams and capabilities that allow West to not just track ships and conduct advanced due diligence operations, but to try and stay ahead of what is a constantly evolving web of sanctions coming from multiple regimes, not always with as much clarity as you might assume. So why am I telling you how hard it's been for the poor P&I clubs, I hear you ask? Well, it's because it's crucial to understanding why we've ended up facing the prospect of very expensive and damaging uninsured oil spills potentially becoming a very serious global problem. When the West took aim at Russian oil revenues, unleashing the biggest and longest sustained deluge of energy sanctions ever imposed on a single country, it was trying to do two almost contradictory things: punish Moscow financially by cutting Russia's fossil fuel earnings, but do so without also reducing the global supply of oil and fueling inflation that hurts consumers around the world. The flawed nature of the oil price cap regime is hardly news, but while the rest of the industry gets to criticise from the sidelines, it's the P&I clubs who've been left to walk a precarious regulatory tightrope.
It's extremely difficult, and it's extremely difficult in many scenarios, and it's very difficult not just for us. It's very difficult for our members, and they are ultimately the people on the front line that have to bear the consequences of all of this. We as clubs have our rules, and our rules protect us, because they say that if a member is engaged in a sanctionable activity, then there is no cover. Cover automatically drops away, so we're protected. If a ship owner ends up in a situation where they're undertaking some sanctionable activity, which may not be by their own volition, then they are fully exposed to the full enforcement of sanctions. So it is extremely difficult. And the price cap and the cargo price that you spoke about there is a really good example where this system was introduced, but it is proving very difficult to try and police in practice. The whole basis of this is that tier 3 actors, the ones at the bottom, are nowhere near the sales contract, do not and will never know the sale price of the cargo. We will never be told that. The shipper will never be told that, because the charterer trader will never give away that information and give away their margins. So we will never know that information. So the whole structure was that we understand you'll never know that, so here you can rely on an attestation. Now, the attestation is simply a piece of paper produced by a trader or a shipper in Russia. It might well be that some of those attestations are not entirely honest, let's say. So, but what do we do about it? It's a circular argument, because we can't then go and ask someone to say, oh, we think the attestation might be wrong, tell us what the price is, because they won't tell us the price, so we can rely on an attestation. So there are those kind of frustrations where it's very difficult to go sufficiently far in order to have absolute certainty. I'll give you another example. We have there's been stories of a few leading ship owners who have been offered a cargo loaded ship-to-ship transfer out here in Asia. They've taken it, and then it's come to light that, in fact, it wasn't an Iraqi cargo, it was an Iranian cargo originally. When you look into it, that might have been 5 STS transfers earlier that had originally came out of Iran, and all of which have been very cleverly masked. So how is the ship owner supposed to, even the ones doing the proper due diligence, how are they supposed to be able to look back through 5 or 6 over several weeks transfers in order to try and establish that this was a cargo that came out of Iran? It's extremely difficult. And as I said, some leading names in the industry have unfortunately been caught by it. So just another example of where it can be very difficult to try and get to that complete clarity of due diligence that the regulators somehow think that we can achieve.
The clubs have been politely telling government and industry for some time now that it is not for them to determine what should or should not be considered a lawful trade. And yet government and industry are increasingly looking to them for answers and enforcement they can't provide. The legal and administrative costs that have landed on the IG clubs' desks as a result of this capricious policy is, of course, a problem for the clubs. But this is an issue affecting the whole industry because, as the international group of P&I Clubs, of which American and West are members, told the UK government in no uncertain terms recently, the price cap is flawed and it is increasingly unenforceable. And yet, on a daily basis, that's what the clubs are trying to do, enforce the unenforceable. Back to Dan.
As you correctly pointed out, we have to rely on the documentation that has been provided to us. We are not oil traders. We are so far removed from those ultimate transactions, the sales of the product, that it's practically impossible for us to find out if an attestation is valid, especially if, for example, we receive the attestation from our ship owner member who has received a similar attestation from his charter, who's probably received another similar attestation from the supplier of the cargo or its subcharter. So there's a series of documentation that ultimately reaches the P&I Club. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about, in the press especially, the price of euros, or the price is well above the price cap. Okay, well, where's that based on? Is there documentation that shows that? We certainly, as a P&I Club, have no way of getting our hands on any documentation that would show ultimately how much oil was sold. And so we have to rely on that attestation. If there's any doubt, and there's many instances where there is doubt, we have been afforded an extra weapon, if you will, by the authorities, by the regulators, in that we can go back and say to our respective member, hey, listen, we'd like you to provide us all the documentation supporting the ancillary costs associated with the transport of this oil. That might give us some indication that something here is not right, or that the numbers do not coincide. However, in the instances where we have requested this ancillary cost documentation, we've been through it, and based on the naked eye of what we're looking at, everything looks consistent. We haven't come across a situation yet where the ancillary cost documentation has caused us to have to take further action. So it again, we are not experts in this field. Our expertise is in providing insurance.
All of this, of course, leads us to the dark fleet, that shadowy trade of vintage tankers trading outside of this flawed and yet rapidly growing complex sanctions regime. But the dark fleet is not a homogeneous thing. There's no universally agreed definition, and it is these uncertainties and grey areas that are presenting the difficulties.
There are those that may or may not be within the mainstream system that are doing demonstrably sanctionable activity, but there's also, and this comes to the dark fleet, parallel fleet, call it what you will, the other unintended consequence of the sanctions regime, not only has it put pressure on clubs to do more, and that's meant more vessels exiting clubs because the sanctions checking that we're now obliged to apply, but it's also had the unintended consequence of generating a fleet that stands outside the impact of particularly the sanctions against Russia. So the G7, with their objectives of the price cap regime, which was to keep oil flowing but to minimize the revenue that Russia would earn from those trades in order to support their war, that was all, I think, built on an assumption. The house was bet on the fact that ship owners, being the people carrying oil from Russia to wherever they could sell it to, would want to stay with all of those G7 providers. They would want to keep with their Western banks. They would want to keep with an IG club. They would want to keep with a top class classification society. They would want to keep with a decent flag. And I think that where it's gone wrong for them is they didn't foresee that there would be owners and even a new generation of owners who would not want to do that and who would be prepared to set up a new entity, and it's with a corporate structure that is deliberately intended to avoid any contact with any G7 service provider. And if that's what they do, then they can then carry that oil irrespective of price cap without being in breach of sanctions that are applied by wherever they're domiciled. And the G7 sanctions, the US, the EU, and the UK sanctions can't touch them. So that, I think, has been the primary frustration for the regulators. And it's why when the IG made the submission to the UK Parliament, we said that this has now become, the price cap regime has become largely enforceable just because of the amount of ships that is generated who are beyond the reach of these sanctions because of that kind of corporate structure. Now, recently we met with a senior person from OFAC here in Singapore, the clubs, and he said that they thought that the oil price cap was having a good impact, not least because it was pushing ships back from this kind of structure and from being outside the mainstream back into the mainstream, and was pushing ships from other insurers back into the IG clubs. Well, I'm afraid we had to disabuse him of that fantasy rather quickly and roundly. And the fact is that the price cap is acting as a giant pair of bellows and is just expanding the shadow fleet all the time.
The main catalyst for growth of the parallel fleet, or dark fleet, or whatever you want to call it, is not so much ships removed from the international group clubs and then moving to less reputable insurers, although that clearly does happen, but rather the fact that because of the oil price cap regime, new operators are specifically establishing themselves with corporate structures which do not rely on G7 coalition services and providers at all, and thus it puts them perfectly legitimately beyond the scope of the oil price sanctions. Unfortunately, that also typically means the use of low-quality flags and class, plus insurance that is probably illusory in the event of an accident.
What has happened now is there are all these vessels, as you've correctly pointed out, that as far as we can tell and know, based on their age, on their condition, on their possible lack of maintenance, are prone to incidents. They could be bad weather related, could be anything at all. And then the question will be, if such a vessel sinks, and I'd like to use an example, though it's not really part of the dark fleet. I recently read how a vessel that sank is leaking part of its cargo, which was some type of fertilizer, which is damaging to the ecosystem. It's damaging to the coastline of the neighboring 3, 4, 5 countries. And there's no P&I insurance. There's no insurance at all. So all of those costs First, the cost, setting aside the environmental damage, those costs are going to have to be borne by the neighboring countries, which will then be passed on to their citizens somehow. So it's difficult for me to see how this is good for anyone in the world.
The problem here is not the fact that G7 shipping and service providers are legitimately participating in the oil price cap scheme. The problem is the rapid growth of the fleet of vessels that exists in the main to transport Russian oil outside of that price cap scheme. And these are not good ships. They are not, in the main, well-maintained ships, precisely because they are operating outside of mainstream insurance, class, Western maritime services, and generally trying their best to avoid anything approaching oversight or scrutiny.
We all know that tanker operations are always high-risk operations. We are carrying highly hazardous cargoes. The crew needs extensive training. The ship needs to be, the tankers need to be on top of their game with regards to equipment, to training, to facilities, to keeping all the safety equipment and operational equipment at the best of their operating performances. When you have a ship which is required to operate at such high level of operation to ensure safety, and then you have a completely different objective, which is trying to hide their whole operations, that automatically raises the risk profile significantly, in my view. Hence, if you're operating a high-risk vessel, which requires highest levels of safety, with a complete different objective, then you're digressing from your main objective, which is run safe operation and run safe vessels. From that perspective, definitely it will have some impact.
That's Captain Rahul Khanna, Global Head of Marine Risk Consulting at Allianz, and many of you will be familiar with his annual assessment of maritime risk, which this year contains some pretty eye-opening reading on the safety of the dark fleet.
So I think the problem can be extensive. Right now, we have seen something like 50 incidents to date, safety incidents on these vessels. Some of them are being catastrophic in the sense that there have been explosions, there have been loss of life, and some of the others not so much. But the difference between a large accident and a smaller one is sometimes only a little bit of luck or a few variables which nobody knows how they're going to play out. So the potential for a large catastrophic loss is definitely there. And we certainly feel that this needs to be addressed by the industry. Now, I know there's a lot of political angles to this, probably well beyond people like us, including insurance or ship owners or all. So somebody else needs to step in. But the problem, what we are highlighting is that safety does get impacted if we are running ships loaded with hundreds and thousands of tons of oils and other hazardous and explosive material with not enough regards to safety. That's the key issue for us.
Now, given some of the frankly terrifying reports we've seen, 50 incidents involving dark fleet vessels is perhaps less than you might have anticipated, but it's a number that is likely to grow.
Personally, I won't be surprised if the number is higher next year because of the way it's going, because we don't see a solution in sight as of now. So the trade is even flourishing, if I may say so. Now you bring an interesting aspect of liability and insurances, and that is another big worry from a cost perspective to the insurance sector and to the industry in general, because some of these vessels may not have enough insurances behind them. And if they are involved in a large-scale incident, for example, a large pollution incident, the cost of those we already know from previous experiences can be hundreds of millions. And where does that money come from if they don't have enough requisite insurances behind it, or they are not covering their liabilities? That will be a huge headache, not just for the industry, the people involved, but the coastal states. And some of the smaller ones will probably have devastating effects on their coastlines, on their businesses like fisheries and tourism, which we have seen in previous oil spills. So yes, that is another big worry on the shuttle fleet, that whether they're covering their liabilities, they have requisite insurances in place or not.
So what happens next? The age, poor condition, and dangerous and deceptive shipping practices employed by these ships have created a global problem that is only going to get worse without a significant shift in sanctions policy. What that shift might look like, however, that's not clear.
What I hope is not happening is that, in the 70s and 80s, and you had lots of tankers that were, flew the British flag and the other European flags and US flag and were crewed by British and European and American nationals, etc. Flags of convenience came along and wiped away all of that in an instant, and ships were then operated on the kind of lower cost operator model that we see today. I think the interesting question for the industry is that if magically all the sanctions were lifted tomorrow, what would happen to the shadow fleet? Some of it will be scrapped, I'm sure, because they're very old ships. But would all of it come back into the mainstream and enter into IG clubs and come back into all the Western providers? I don't know. My concern is that there might be a rump, and it might be a significant rump of ships that remain out there who think there is now an alternative operating model in the industry to have driven costs even lower by going to a lower quality flag, a low quality classification society, and maybe an insurer that will charge a low premium, but you get less in return. If that is an operating model that will be sustained and will be allowed to be sustained in our industry, then that is of great concern to us, I think.
Sanctions were not created to introduce the risk of uninsured large-scale environmental disasters, clearly. But that is effectively the unintended side effect of the way in which they've been created. If a ship doesn't have adequate insurance and the inevitable happens, there are going to be some very significant consequences for everybody to consider. Insurance is obviously part of that conversation, but a lot of the responsibility here ultimately goes back to the same states that are currently enforcing flawed sanctions that really need to do better in their role as flag and port states.
But the solution, I think, in large part lies with the flag states. In order to be able to trade, these ships need a convention certificate, a civil liability, a CLC convention certificate. That's the convention that sets a liability and compensation regime for the spill of persistent oil from tankers. In order to do that, they go to their flag state and they must produce evidence of an insurance policy or other financial guarantee, but it's usually an insurance policy. And it is then, under Article 7 of the CLC, it is then the obligation of the flag state to satisfy themselves that that insurance that's being offered in support of an application for a convention certificate is adequate to respond to the potential liabilities that arise under CLC. So to respond to an oil spill and to pay compensation to all the victims of that oil spill. And if there are cases where flag states are accepting an insurance policy that's not adequate to meet those liabilities, then that is a large part of the issue. And we've seen that recently with the Tobago spill, which the IOPC fund have had to pick up because it's a spill where the ship owner cannot, and insurer cannot and will not respond. And we've seen the director of the IOPC fund coming out and saying, essentially to states, look, the way this is developing, if we're not careful, the IOPC fund will end up being the kind of pollution insurer of last resort because there isn't sufficient scrutiny going into the quality of the insurance that's being used to support ships trading to CLC states. So I think it's important that the message is out there that there is a job to be done on the part of states. We might not like this parallel fleet, but it's there, but there is a job to be done on the part of states to try and ensure that the important piece of the jigsaw that's in place to respond when there is that spill, and it's not if, it'll be when there is that spill, is sufficient to respond.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave this edition. Clearly, this is a complex topic, and I am well aware that there are going to be some of you out there screaming at me through the digital ether that I have not covered some crucial details. I agree, and I will inevitably have to return to this topic. Asking whether sanctions are working is easy enough. Doing something about that is much, much harder. And in the meantime, though, it's the P&I Clubs that continue to hold up a flawed regime based on information they have no way of verifying, trying their best to answer increasingly unanswerable questions about the nature of the dark fleet that this policy has essentially created. And that, I thought, was at least one aspect of the issue worth highlighting. there will be more. My thanks, though, to Tony and Dan and Rahul for contributing this week and patiently walking me through some complex details. And thank you for listening and sticking with it. We will be back next week. Goodbye.